What happens in someone's mind when you stop explaining, stop chasing, and simply disappear? Not emotionally, not dramatically, but silently. Most people think disappearing makes you forgettable. Psychology says the opposite. Stay with me till the end, because the last point explains why disappearing often creates more attachment than staying ever could. When someone suddenly disappears, the first assumption people make is that the other person will feel relief. Relief from expectations, from emotional responsibility, from having to show up. But psychologically, that is rarely what happens, especially in female psychology, where emotional processing is deeply reflective rather than dismissive. Absence does not erase emotional memory, it activates it. When you are no longer present, the mind does not relax. It starts working overtime. It begins to ask questions it never bothered asking when you were available. This is because presence creates familiarity, and familiarity numbs awareness. Your consistency made you predictable. Your predictability made you background noise. And once that noise stops, the silence becomes impossible to ignore. The human brain is wired to notice change, not stability. When something constant disappears, the mind treats it as a disruption that needs explanation. That's where reflection begins. They don't feel peace. They feel unsettled. Not because they suddenly realize they love you, but because something emotionally reliable has vanished without warning. The brain tries to regain balance by revisiting past interactions, replaying conversations, reanalyzing tone, behavior, and moments that previously felt insignificant. What did you mean when you said that? Why didn't they notice this before? Was there a sign they missed? Reflection is not romantic at first. It's investigative. And investigation keeps emotional attention locked on you far longer than affection ever did. Absence also removes the emotional shortcut people rely on. When you were present, they didn't need to think about how they felt about you. You were simply there. Your availability answered the question for them. But once you disappear, that shortcut is gone. They can no longer rely on routine to define the relationship, so they are forced to consciously evaluate it. And conscious evaluation is where emotional depth forms. They begin to notice patterns, how you showed up, how you supported, how you adjusted, how you stayed calm when things were unclear. These realizations don't come when someone is still accessible. They come when access is revoked. What's important here is that reflection is uncomfortable. It challenges the illusion of control. When someone believes they can reach you at any time, they feel emotionally dominant, even if they never consciously thought about it. Your disappearance disrupts that power dynamic. Suddenly, they are no longer choosing when connection happens, and that loss of choice creates mental friction. The mind doesn't ask, "Do I miss them?" It asks, "Why am I thinking about them so much?" That question alone is enough to reopen emotional doors they thought were closed. Reflection also has a way of reorganizing memory. When you're present, flaws are magnified and strengths are normalized. When you're absent, the opposite happens. The mind starts highlighting what felt emotionally safe, familiar, and grounding about you. Not because you are perfect, but because your absence creates contrast. Emotional contrast sharpens perception. And once perception sharpens, indifference becomes difficult to maintain. This is why people often say, "I didn't realize what you meant to me until you were gone." It's not poetic. It's neurological. Absence forces introspection, but it also forces accountability. When you leave without chaos, without explanation, without emotional begging, the mind has no external drama to blame. There's no argument to point at, no explosive ending to justify detachment. So the reflection turns inward. What role did I play? What did I overlook? Why didn't I take this seriously when it was there? And this internal questioning is far more powerful than any emotional confrontation because it cannot be defended against. Silence gives no closure, and the mind hates unfinished emotional business. It keeps returning to it, turning it over, searching for resolution, replaying moments, reassessing meaning, questioning assumptions, and slowly realizing that what felt optional may not have been as replaceable as they believed. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness, but psychologically, silence is stimulus. When you stop speaking, stop reacting, stop explaining, the emotional mind does not shut down. It leans in. In female psychology especially, silence is not processed as absence of interest. It is processed as missing information, and the brain is deeply uncomfortable with missing information. It needs context, narrative, meaning. When you were present and expressive, everything was available. Your emotions were readable. Your intentions felt accessible. There was no mystery to solve. But the moment silence appears, the emotional system shifts from passive reception to active pursuit. Curiosity is born not from what is said, but from what is withheld. Silence creates a psychological vacuum, and the mind instinctively tries to fill it. When you don't respond, when you don't clarify, when you don't give emotional feedback, the brain begins constructing theories. Are you hurt? Are you indifferent? Are you stronger than before? Have you emotionally detached? Each unanswered question fuels another layer of curiosity. And curiosity is not neutral, it is engaging. It keeps emotional attention alive. People assume curiosity fades quickly, but unresolved curiosity intensifies over time. The longer the silence lasts, the more the mind invests in understanding it. And the more mental energy someone invests in you, the more emotionally significant you become. What makes silence powerful is that it removes emotional predictability. Predictability is comforting, but it is also numbing. When someone knows exactly how you'll respond, your emotional presence becomes background. Silence disrupts that pattern. The emotional brain suddenly loses its ability to anticipate you, and when anticipation disappears, awareness returns. They begin to notice your absence, not just physically, but emotionally. The lack of reaction becomes louder than any reaction ever was. Silence doesn't shout, but it echoes. It leaves space for interpretation, and interpretation is where emotional attachment often deepens. Silence also shifts the internal dialogue. When communication is constant, the emotional focus stays external on what you're saying, what you're doing, how you're behaving. When silence enters, the focus turns inward. Instead of analyzing your words, they begin analyzing their feelings. Why does this bother me? Why do I care? Why am I checking for a message that isn't coming? These questions arise not because of emotional weakness, but because silence interrupts emotional certainty. And uncertainty demands attention. The mind does not let unanswered emotional questions rest easily. It keeps returning to them, circling them, trying to resolve them. There is also an element of emotional projection that silence invites. Without new information, the mind fills the gap with memory. Past moments are replayed, tone is reinterpreted, meaning is reassigned. Things you said months ago suddenly feel heavier. Moments that seemed small gain emotional weight. Silence gives memory room to breathe, and memory is rarely objective. It is selective, emotional, and biased toward what felt safe or meaningful. This is why silence often causes people to remember you more positively than reality ever deserved. Not because silence lies, but because it removes distractions that once diluted emotional impact. Silence also subtly challenges emotional hierarchy. When you were communicative, they were reacting to you. When you become silent, they begin reacting to the absence of you. That shift matters. Emotional curiosity often disguises itself as concern, irritation, or confusion, but underneath it is a desire to re-establish emotional understanding. Silence takes away their ability to emotionally locate you. And when someone can't locate you emotionally, they feel unsettled. Not knowing where you stand is far more destabilizing than knowing you're upset or disappointed. Silence removes emotional coordinates, and the mind keeps searching for them. Most importantly, silence invites imagination. And imagination is far more powerful than reality. Reality has limits. Imagination does not. In silence, they imagine your growth, your detachment, your emotional independence. They imagine you moving on, becoming unavailable, becoming someone they can no longer access. That imagined version of you often feels more compelling than the real one ever did. Silence allows you to exist as possibility rather than certainty. And psychologically, people are far more drawn to what feels uncertain yet meaningful than to what is familiar and emotionally accessible. Silence doesn't beg for attention, but it commands reflection, fuels curiosity, reshapes emotional perception, and quietly repositions you from predictable presence to unanswered question. Control in emotional dynamics is rarely about dominance or intention. It is about predictability. The person who is more predictable is usually the one with less psychological leverage. When you were consistently present, emotionally responsive, attentive, available, you unknowingly surrendered control of the emotional rhythm. They knew when you would reply, how you would react, how much reassurance you would offer. That certainty gave them comfort, but it also gave them power, not because they demanded it, but because your attention was reliable. And reliability, when unreciprocated, slowly transfers control away from the giver. The moment you withdraw attention, that dynamic fractures, not dramatically, not aggressively, but structurally. The emotional system that once felt balanced suddenly loses its anchor. Attention is not just affection, it is regulation. It tells the other person where they stand, how much influence they have, and how safe the connection feels. When that regulation disappears, the emotional balance tilts. They no longer know how to position themselves in relation to you. And that uncertainty shifts control, not to you as a manipulator, but to you as someone no longer emotionally accessible on demand. What's crucial to understand is that control is felt most when it is lost. While you were attentive, they didn't feel powerful, they felt normal. Power becomes visible only when it is removed. Your absence exposes how much emotional orientation depended on your presence. Suddenly, they are the ones checking, waiting, wondering. The internal roles reverse. You are no longer reacting to them. They are reacting to the lack of you. And reaction is a position of psychological disadvantage. The mind becomes preoccupied with regaining equilibrium, not because of desire, but because loss of control creates discomfort. With attention withdrawn, emotional initiative changes hands. Before, you were initiating conversations, clarifying misunderstandings, smoothing emotional edges. That effort kept the emotional environment stable. Once you stop doing that labor, the environment becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability forces engagement. They may not immediately reach out, but internally, the shift is already happening. The emotional system is recalibrating, trying to understand why the dynamic changed without negotiation. Control shifts not because you asserted it, but because you stopped compensating for imbalance. This shift also exposes emotional dependency that previously went unnoticed. When someone relies on your attention to feel emotionally secure, they don't label it as dependency. They label it as normal connection. But once that attention disappears, the reliance becomes visible. They begin to feel emotionally ungrounded, not because you were their everything, but because you were a consistent reference point. Removing that reference forces the mind to confront how much stability it borrowed from you. And confronting dependency often leads to increased emotional focus on the source that once provided it. Another layer of this control shift is psychological boundary redefinition. When you remain accessible regardless of how you're treated, boundaries blur. Your withdrawal redraws them without explanation. And boundaries that appear suddenly are far more impactful than boundaries that are negotiated. They signal a change in self-perception. They suggest that you are no longer organizing your behavior around maintaining emotional proximity. That alone alters how you are perceived. People instinctively respect what they cannot easily influence, not because it's cruel, but because it appears self-directed. As attention withdraws, emotional value is recalculated. Attention functions like currency. When it is abundant, it is undervalued. When it becomes scarce, its worth is reassessed. This does not mean they suddenly see you as superior. It means they become aware of the cost of losing access to you. That awareness often leads to heightened emotional sensitivity. They may become more cautious, more reflective, more deliberate in how they think about you. Control in this sense is not about winning. It is about no longer giving away emotional authority over your time, energy, and presence. The most important shift happens internally. When you withdraw attention, you stop orbiting their emotional needs. That internal recentering changes your posture in the dynamic, even in absence, and that change is felt. Emotional systems are highly sensitive to imbalance. When one person stops leaning forward, the other becomes aware of the distance. Control shifts not because you demanded it, but because you reclaimed your emotional gravity. When someone disappears, the first emotional response is rarely love, longing, or sadness. It is ego disruption. The ego is responsible for self-image, emotional hierarchy, and perceived importance. It asks one central question: where do I stand? As long as you were present and emotionally available, that question had a comfortable answer. Your attention validated their position in your world. They didn't have to earn it or question it. It was simply there. When you disappear, that validation is abruptly removed and the ego feels exposed. Before the heart has time to process loss, the ego reacts to the sudden drop in significance. Ego discomfort often disguises itself as indifference at first. They may tell themselves you don't matter, that your absence is inconsequential. But indifference does not require internal dialogue. When someone is truly unaffected, they don't need to convince themselves. The moment justification appears, the ego is already involved. Your disappearance forces the ego to reassess its ranking. Am I still important to them? Did I misread my value? Why didn't they try harder? These questions are not about connection. They are about identity. And identity, once shaken, demands resolution. The ego also struggles with unanswered exits. If you had left dramatically through conflict, accusation, or emotional explanation, the ego would have had something to push against. It could frame itself as right, wronged, or superior. But silent disappearance offers no such narrative. There is no emotional confrontation to dominate, no argument to win, no story that preserves ego comfort. That absence of narrative creates a vacuum, and in that vacuum, the ego turns inward, searching for reassurance. Why didn't I see this coming? Why wasn't I enough to make them stay engaged? Why didn't they need closure from me? Another key element is the loss of emotional leverage. While you were present, they assumed your emotional investment would keep you accessible. That assumption fed the ego a sense of security. When you disappear without emotional collapse, it contradicts that belief. It suggests you are capable of detachment. And detachment challenges the ego deeply because it implies independence. The ego prefers to believe it is the center of emotional gravity. Your disappearance quietly says otherwise, and that realization is often far more unsettling than rejection. The ego also reacts to comparison, even when none is visible. Silence invites imagined competition. Are you happier without them? Have you found someone else? Are you growing, moving on, becoming emotionally unavailable? These imagined scenarios threaten ego stability because they imply replaceability. Even if none of it is true, the possibility alone is enough to activate ego defense mechanisms. The ego would rather be disliked than irrelevant, and disappearance flirts dangerously close to irrelevance, which is why it provokes such strong internal response. Over time, ego reaction often evolves into emotional curiosity or renewed interest, not because the heart suddenly awakens, but because the ego wants to restore its position. Reconnection becomes a way to reassert importance, to confirm that they still matter to you. This is why ego-driven outreach often feels confusing. Affection may be inconsistent, timing may feel selfish, and intentions may be unclear. The heart hasn't spoken yet. The ego is still negotiating. What makes this dynamic powerful is that the ego reacts silently. There may be no immediate message, no dramatic confession, no visible pursuit, but internally the ego keeps score. It notices how often you cross their mind, how your absence lingers, how unresolved your disappearance feels. Only after the ego has processed its threat does the heart get involved. And by then, the emotional landscape has already shifted. Your disappearance has repositioned you from someone emotionally accessible to someone emotionally autonomous. And autonomy is one of the few things the ego cannot easily dismiss. The human mind is deeply uncomfortable with incomplete emotional experiences. It seeks closure the way the body seeks balance. When something ends without explanation, without resolution, without emotional finality, the mind does not register it as finished. It registers it as suspended. Your sudden disappearance leaves an emotional loop open. There was no conclusion, no last conversation, no mutual agreement that things were over. And because of that, the emotional system keeps returning to you, not out of longing, but out of unfinished processing. Obsession does not always come from desire. It often comes from incompletion. When emotional business is unfinished, the mind begins to replay events compulsively. Conversations are revisited, moments are reinterpreted, silences are overanalyzed. This isn't nostalgia, it's problem solving. The brain is trying to make sense of something that ended without rules. What went wrong? What changed? Was there a turning point I missed? These questions repeat because they have no answers, and every time the mind revisits them, emotional energy is reinvested. The more energy invested, the harder it becomes to detach. Obsession forms quietly, not as craving, but as mental preoccupation. What intensifies this process is the absence of emotional contrast. When a relationship ends dramatically, the pain eventually burns out. There is anger, grief, expression, and release. But when it ends silently, there is no emotional discharge. Feelings remain stored rather than expressed. Stored emotion doesn't fade, it stagnates. And stagnation keeps the emotional experience alive long after the physical connection is gone. Your disappearance doesn't give the mind a clear emotional direction, so it keeps circling the same unanswered space. Unfinished emotional business also creates a distorted sense of possibility. Because nothing was clearly ended, everything feels hypothetically reversible. The mind doesn't label the connection as lost. It labels it as paused. And paused emotions are far more compelling than concluded ones. They carry the illusion of potential. Maybe if I reach out, maybe if circumstances change, maybe if I say the right thing. These imagined scenarios keep the emotional thread intact. Closure ends stories, ambiguity keeps them alive. Another layer of obsession comes from the need to reclaim emotional equilibrium. When you disappear, you take with you a role you once played in their emotional life. You may have been a source of reassurance, validation, familiarity, or emotional grounding. Losing that role without transition destabilizes the system. The mind becomes fixated not just on you as a person, but on the emotional regulation you provided. It isn't always you they miss. It's the emotional function you served. And because that function was tied to you, the mind keeps returning to your absence as the source of imbalance. There is also an element of self-questioning that fuels obsession. When something ends without explanation, people don't just question the other person, they question themselves. Was I misreading the connection? Did I underestimate its value? Did I assume you would always be there? These questions challenge self-trust. And when self-trust is shaken, the mind seeks external confirmation. Obsession becomes a way to revalidate one's emotional judgment. If they can understand why you disappeared, they can restore their sense of emotional competence. Over time, unfinished emotional business begins to feel heavier than resolved loss. Resolved loss has shape and boundaries. It hurts, but it makes sense. Unfinished loss has no edges. It lingers in the background, resurfacing unexpectedly, triggered by memory, association, or silence. Your absence becomes a question mark rather than a period, and the mind is far more drawn to unanswered questions than to completed statements. That is why disappearing without emotional closure often creates deeper fixation than staying and slowly fading away. Disappearing is often misunderstood as a tactic, a strategy, or a way to provoke reaction. But psychologically, disappearing only creates impact when it is rooted in self-respect rather than emotional manipulation. The mind can sense the difference. When someone vanishes out of resentment, insecurity, or the hope of being chased, the absence feels unstable. It carries emotional noise, but when someone disappears because they have quietly chosen themselves, the absence feels solid, and solidity changes perception. It signals internal alignment rather than emotional collapse. Self-respect alters the emotional texture of absence. When you leave from a place of dignity, there is no desperation leaking through the silence, no indirect messaging, no passive signals, no checking to see if you're being noticed. That absence feels complete. And completeness is powerful because it communicates emotional independence. The other person doesn't feel punished. They feel displaced. You are no longer orbiting their emotional world. You are standing firmly in your own. And that shift is deeply unsettling to anyone who unconsciously relied on your availability. What makes self-respect so impactful is that it removes emotional negotiation. When someone is unsure of their worth, their disappearance is usually inconsistent. They leave, return, explain, withdraw again. That pattern weakens the effect because it keeps emotional access open. But self-respect closes the door without slamming it. There is no announcement, no justification, just a quiet withdrawal of presence. And the mind interprets that as a decision, not a reaction. Decisions command more respect than reactions ever do. Self-respect also reframes the narrative of absence. Instead of they left because they were hurt, the mind begins to consider they left because they chose to. That distinction matters. Choice implies agency. Agency implies strength, and strength changes how absence is interpreted. It suggests that you are not waiting, not hoping, not lingering emotionally. You have moved forward internally, even if nothing has been said externally. That perception alone can radically shift how you are valued. Another important aspect is emotional congruence. When you disappear with self-respect, your inner state matches your outer behavior. There is no internal contradiction. You are not pretending to be detached while emotionally checking in from afar. That congruence creates emotional clarity, and emotional clarity is felt, even in silence. People sense when someone has genuinely disengaged versus when they are performing detachment. Genuine disengagement carries weight. It feels final, even if nothing has been declared final. Self-respect also removes the need for validation. When you stop seeking confirmation of your worth through their response, the dynamic changes entirely. You are no longer measuring your value based on whether they notice your absence. That internal shift affects how your silence is perceived. Silence driven by self-respect feels calm, not tense. It doesn't demand interpretation. It simply exists. And calm silence often provokes deeper reflection than emotional silence ever could. This kind of disappearance also forces a reevaluation of boundaries. When someone realizes you are no longer accessible by default, they are confronted with the limits of their influence. They cannot summon you emotionally, cannot provoke reaction, cannot rely on your consistency. That boundary feels new, and new boundaries require adjustment. Adjustment often begins with respect, not admiration, not love. Respect for someone who knows when to walk away without burning the ground behind them. Self-respect-driven absence also protects you from returning to imbalance. Because the disappearance wasn't meant to trigger a reaction, you are not emotionally dependent on the outcome. Whether they reach out or remain silent, your internal position remains intact. That stability is crucial. It ensures that disappearing does not become another way of abandoning yourself. Instead, it becomes an extension of self-alignment. You are no longer present where you are undervalued, misunderstood, or emotionally minimized. Finally, disappearing with self-respect changes how you see yourself. You stop associating worth with endurance. You stop believing that staying longer proves commitment. You recognize that leaving can sometimes be the most self-honoring response. And when you honor yourself internally, that energy shapes how your absence is experienced externally, not as a loss filled with chaos, but as a quiet removal of something that once gave more than it received.